Welcome back to another episode of The Loco Fit Show, where we redefine what healthy means to you. I'm your host, Lauren Conlon, and this week I'm joined by Rick, our team mental health counselor, and we're going to talk about diagnoses. And are they good? Are they bad? Are they being overly done? Are people over-identifying with them? And just kind of have a general discussion on this. It's not, it's really just kind of more personal thoughts and kind of things that we're seeing and things that you're seeing, you know, in your practice and just kind of in general in like the world of therapy. And I think that this is a really important discussion because as there is a rise in diagnoses and as there is a rise in talking about this, which I think is great, there's also downsides to that, or there's a darker side, maybe not downside, but there's a darker side to this that I think has been really proliferated by social media in particular, and just more people, I think, going to therapy, which is definitely a good thing. But just like, you know, there's a lot of good therapists and there's a lot of maybe not as great therapists, right? Who are sometimes enabling people and behaviors, and not necessarily because of a diagnosis or not. But anyways, we're going to have a general discussion on that. So in your opinion, what, just out the gate, how have you seen this affect people, right? Like, have you seen this big increase? Like I'm seeing this just in kind of general conversation and just general world.
Well, I've seen both. I've seen it be good and bad. But what I will say is due to the increase in awareness of mental health disorders, you are seeing people sometimes misdiagnose and overdiagnose a problem, you know, that isn't there. One of the first diagnoses that comes to mind is attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD. You know, it used to be very different, you know, when you go back several DSMs, what it used to be and what it is now, and how people identify it, you know, and you know, autism, I feel like, is the same way. It's kind of like, well, you can look at a certain set of criteria and say, yes, I meet this criteria. But what does it mean for you? What does it mean for that child? What does it mean for the person? Is this a good thing that we've given them this diagnosis? Is it a bad thing that we've given them this diagnosis? I've seen some people over-identify to an extreme degree with what the diagnosis is that they've been given and then use it as a crutch. Other people, them hearing a diagnosis and reading and learning about it is like this really freeing, I don't want to call it rebirthing experience, but like just like an awakening experience within them. Like, okay, there's an explanation as to why I am the way that I am. I have seen it, though, take more of a negative bend in the sense that I've seen people use the diagnosis as a tool for excuse making and as a method to not grow as a person or within their relationship in whatever context they're talking about.
Yeah, I feel like it's so... I think partly there's a rise in diagnoses, right? Because the diagnosing criteria is getting more specific, right? Like there's certainly an argument to be made there. Like, hey, there's better diagnosing criteria. Like people are paying more attention to this, right? There's a rise in just general talk about this. It's not as hush hush. Like we've not just broken past that. I feel like we've like blown past that, right? Like before it used to be this like taboo thing. And I don't feel like this is taboo like at all anymore.
No.
Right? Like we're past the point, I feel like, maybe with certain generations, maybe with like older generations. Maybe they're still a little bit more potentially resistant.
Of the military, I would still say it's still pretty taboo in the military.
But that's because they then can't do certain things, right? Like I think if you're...
Security clearances become an issue.
Yeah. If you're diagnosed in a certain way, then you can't, you know, do certain things and you might have your job at jeopardy. So I think that partly it's just, I guess, a byproduct of that, right? Like I would imagine. But yeah, so there are certainly certain instances where it's still a little bit taboo, but just in general, I feel like we're way past that. But now it's like, and we've talked about this before on, I can't remember what podcast, but it was kind of the idea of like, people are talking about mental health, but it's almost this like platitude of like, we care about mental health. And it's like, okay, yay. Now what? Like, what are you doing about it? Like a company can say that to like make people feel good. Like, we care about your mental health. It's like, okay, so then what are we actually doing like about that? Like, are
Are you giving them more time off? Are you giving them access to counseling and resources? Like, what are you doing to help promote mental health?
Yeah. Are you just saying that you support the cause? Like that doesn't do anything for anybody. You know what I mean? And I feel like there has been definitely a rise of, particularly through social media, right? Whether it's, Instagram or TikTok, I would say those are primarily the two main things, where people now, I see these videos constantly where it's like, bullet points of highly functioning masking, bump, bump, bump. And it's like, oh, like you have this now. And like, if you experience these things, you must have this. And it's like, oh my gosh, like it's very overwhelming when you see that. And then of course, the way that social media works is if you see one video, then you see 50 of them because that's how the algorithm works. Right. You know what I mean? So then you're like, oh, I'm now convinced that I have 3 disorders that I just learned about because of these videos. And while they're well-intentioned, because I understand trying to bring awareness to things, then it's like, is that actually helping someone, right? Like versus actually going to therapy and working with a therapist who is challenging you and not just placating you, right? Because I've heard that from many, many people, which is why I originally wanted to partner with you, because I was just tired of hearing from my clients that like literally their therapist would not challenge them at all. And they would just kind of go along with whatever they were saying. And I was like, that doesn't make any, like the whole point is to challenge people, not to just relive stories, not to just talk about the same things over and over again. Like, how are we creating tools? And like, sometimes that means like having hard conversations and not always leaving going like, oh man, I feel really good about that. Like, like you're leaving, people are leaving being like, wow, that was a really hard thing. I don't even know how I feel about that quite yet. Like, I'm going to have to like process that and work through that and like actually take tangible steps. But I feel like now there's so much where it's just like, oh yeah, like you said, like you're using this in a way where it's like, now I'm kind of using it as like almost like an excuse. And I feel like sometimes the over labeling can do that. And I don't know, are people coming to you like differently now? Like what are you seeing? And I know you're just seeing one subset of individuals, but are you talking to other therapists who are experiencing these things too? Like where's the pulse there?
Well, okay. So one thing I want to talk about would be the post that reference towards social media. And you start to see posts where you're like, yeah, here's a bullet point of these things. And if you're this, then you start to feel that. And obviously it starts to send you more videos. And so you feel this overwhelming component where you're like, I've got 2 or 3 different diagnoses. Well, here's the thing. And I remember talking to one of my professors about this, Dr. Monaco, when we were doing diagnosis and pathology and all that kind of stuff. And I was like, you can almost find yourself in every diagnosis if you look hard enough. And so what's relevant to me, and this is the part that I try and tell people, is like diagnosing matters, but at the same time, diagnosing doesn't matter. It is not just a defining characteristic of who you are. It is an ever evolving concept. And so a person doesn't just come in, you don't look at them as a certain set of symptoms and then say, this is what you are. Well, those symptoms of, feelings of emptiness, low energy, okay, those are symptoms, but that doesn't encompass me as a father. That doesn't mean the husband that I am. That doesn't mean the sister that I am. That doesn't talk about the wife that I am or the mother that I am or the coworker that I am, right? And so there's so much more than just a list of symptoms and characteristics and traits that make up who you are as a person. And to that, I would also say, depending on the life circumstances that the person might find themselves in, they might identify more with a particular diagnosis at that point. But 6 months from now, it might be very different. And a year from now will be even more different. And 10 years from now, this might not even resemble who the person is. And so this is kind of why it's like, should diagnosing matter? To a certain degree, yes. In the sense that it matters in the sense of, I see this person and they have a very particular set of behaviors and patterns that are continuously demonstrating and creating significant impairment in their life, in their social relationships, in their occupational relationships, in their physical health. You can clearly see patterns that are playing out like, okay, now we have a reason to it. But if a person goes through a breakup, if a person loses their job, if a person moves cities, right? A person may be ecstatic about an opportunity to move someplace, get there, and then a month or 2 into it, be like, this is not what I wanted. And now all of a sudden they find themselves completely removed, completely isolated, low energy, their appetite has changed, and it's like, oh, well, you're depressed. Okay, like, sure, but there's a little bit more to it. Why am I depressed? I'm depressed because I'm this type of person who wants to connect with their environment, who has these goals and these meanings and this purpose, and none of this environment feeds into that. So is it that I'm just a depressed person where I'm going to be this way no matter where I am? Or is it more of the life stage that I'm in? Am I depressed or am I feeling certain things because I'm 32 years old and I'm single and everybody else in my life is married? Am I this way because somebody just passed away and died? Am I feeling anxious because now I'm older and I don't have enough money for retirement? So you can see how, you can come in and you can present with a list of symptoms, and if anybody has a symptom checklist, they can run down it, just like the same way I'm looking at this person's Instagram, and they're like, oh, if you've done this, this, and this, you're like, oh, well, that's me.
Oh my gosh.
Fuck. Okay. And then you start looking at it, and it's like, well, when am I not those things anymore? And I wasn't always this, and when is it relevant? This happened when I was 32 as opposed to when I was 19. And how long have these symptoms be present? Because sometimes the diagnosis can change based off of the amount of time that the symptoms are even available to us. And the diagnosis can change from one thing when you're a teenager to being something completely different when you're an adult. Take a kid who's 16 years old and behaves a certain way. We might diagnose him with conduct disorder. Well, you know what conduct disorder translates to when you're 18? Antisocial personality disorder, right? That's a pretty big diagnosis to maintain or carry. And so it's like, am I still this person? Did my circumstances in life change? Has my personality changed? Have my experiences in life shaped who I am as an individual, as a person, where now I've developed more empathy because now I've been in environments where there's people that actually care about me? And so you can go back and forth between whatever. I don't care about all that. I'm just saying that the life circumstances and experiences that people have do shape them and change them. And who you are at 16 is going to be different than who you are at 25, and 25 very different than 45. And so it's a fluid art, right? Diagnosing is not something that should just be looked at with a TikTok slide, or even somebody who, a friend of yours, you might be sitting down having a conversation. You're like, oh, I went through therapy, and, I talked to my therapist, and my therapist said I have these things, and I totally identify with me being codependent, which, by the way, codependency is not an actual diagnosis, by the way, right? Dependent personality syndrome, or dependent personality is, but codependency isn't. Post-traumatic stress disorder is a diagnosable is a diagnosis that's in the DSM, but complex PTSD isn't. And so it's like, well, where am I in this? Well, sometimes you're a little bit of this and a little bit of that, and sometimes you're none of all this. And so it's like, stop getting so... I would ask people, I would want to encourage people to stop looking at a diagnosis as an end-all, be-all, and look at it as a fluid thing that is like aspects and elements of who you are based off of situations and life experiences and what you have or haven't experienced at some point in your life.
I really like that idea of it being fluid. And I think that just in general, our experiences and our circumstances are going to dictate how we respond and how we feel. Now, there are certainly some diagnoses that are going to be a little bit less fluid, right?
Correct. And
I think that would be the argument with any kind of the neurodivergent diagnoses, right? Because it's that's how your brain, that's how you were born, that's how your brain is operating. Mm-hmm. But I would say, and you probably agree, that there are probably situations that exacerbate those, right? They make them a lot worse, or somebody can manage them better based on what's happening, right? So there's some diagnoses that are going to be less fluid than others. But when, I guess when and how would someone, because then that begs the argument, do you even want to be diagnosed? Because, right, then it's because you said, sometimes you might have this and then you don't. So as a therapist, how do you balance that, I guess, and sharing or not sharing with certain people? And again, it's going to probably matter on what the diagnosis is, right?
To a certain degree. I mean, there's no great diagnosis. If you were to pull out the DSM, I don't think somebody's going to be point to the diagnosis that says I'm an amazing, awesome person. It doesn't exist. The only thing that you're going to get diagnosed with is something that is potentially going to be seen as an issue. Right?
No, it's definitely in there. It's probably under.
Right. It's under Lauren Conlon.
Hey, I just got the book, so let me go check it out.
So I think what you want to do and what you would hope somebody would do is you have to take into account your understanding of this person. Is this information going to be used in a way that the person is going to use it as an excuse and a crutch and a way to hide and not grow and hide behind? Or is this person going to receive this information and use it as a tool or a catalyst to be like, okay, I understand these complexities, these patterns, these habits exist within me. I can read about this. I can learn about this. I can do tools with it. Like, let's go back to codependency. You could tell somebody, hey, you're codependent. Well, what does that mean? I think it depends on your ability to understand the person and how they're going to use the information, right? If I'm going to give somebody a diagnosis or share their diagnosis with them, are they going to take this diagnosis and then hide behind it? Are they going to use it as an excuse for not changing, not growing, not evolving? Or is the person going to hear the diagnosis, and I know that, and they're going to take it and they're going to read about it and they're going to learn about it, and they might be like, okay, this is an understanding of why I am the way that I am, but it's also an indication of here's some skills and things that I can learn to be different. And so there's a difference between using the diagnosis as a way to hide and not grow versus giving a person information and saying, take this information and let's learn how to be better, right? And so, like, let's take autism, for example. You could tell a person that they're autistic. And, like, what does autism look like? Well, the scale for diagnosing it is very vague in some regard. But, like, let's just say one of the characteristics is, like, a lack of emotional expression, difficulty with social interactions. Okay, let's just take a look at those two. If you give a person a diagnosis and they're like, okay, I'm autistic, and now I'm going to use this as an excuse to never engage in any social interactions, and I'm going to be like, I feel awkward because I'm autistic and I'm not going to do anything, and that's the way that it is. Like, okay, well, you haven't really grown in any way. You might take a person who, give them that information and say, okay, I think you have some autism or autistic traits, and these are some of the ones that I see, and here's why. And then the person's like, okay, what that can do for that person is be very validating for them. It can be like, thank God, I know why I am the way that I am. There's a name to it. It's not just me as this weird individual. It's me as in, like, I now understand that I'm a part of something. Like, that this makes sense, that I finally make sense. So it can be very freeing for them. And they might say, okay, I struggle with social interactions. So what are some skills that I can learn? Even if it's not intuitive to them, they can then learn things that make them feel less awkward. Like, I see that this person is actually trying to do new things, so they feel differently in the setting, or they know that they're interacting in a setting. Like, do you remember, do you ever see the show Big Bang Theory?
Well,
Okay.
I saw it and I didn't like it, so I didn't continue to watch it.
That's fine. One of the guys
I
is
never
very socially awkward.
got the hype.
He's a scientist. And
Sheldon?
Sheldon, yeah.
Yeah.
I forgot his name.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Like the main character.
They're all scientists, actually.
Yeah, like, but I feel like he's the most awkward.
But there's a great scene where he has difficulty interpreting sarcasm. Mm-hmm. And so their neighbor is yelling at him about something, and he has to, and so somebody holds up a sign for him, and he's like, sarcasm, and he's like, oh, got it. So he knows, even though he doesn't feel the anger, he knows that she's upset. And he's able to learn new skills sometimes. Like, for example, people walk in and he sees that they're upset. Even though he doesn't emotionally connect to that person, he knows that when somebody's upset, he's like, oh, they're there. And so he has his kind of go-tos. Or would you like a warm beverage was one of his things. So what's he doing? He's integrating a skill set to make these people, even though he doesn't relate to them, he's trying to become more like them. He's trying to assimilate to how other people process emotions. That's an example of somebody using a diagnosis in a healthy way versus like, I'm autistic, so now I'm going to revert into my own little world.
Withdraw
I'm going to
even
isolate. More. I'm going to withdraw. Exactly. And so, you know, should you tell somebody? I mean, look, if somebody really pushes you for the diagnosis, yeah, you share it with them. But sometimes, you know, you want to be as cautious with giving them that information as you can. Other people will look at it like we just did a podcast on codependency. For some people, you're like, hey, I'm not saying, I'll do this with people. I'll say, I'm not saying at all that you're codependent. But do me a favor, read this book and start to see if there's elements of it that you relate to. And then usually what happens is people come back and they're like, yes, like this is me, I do this. And it's like, great. And people will ask, am I codependent? I'm like, does it matter? We've learned this information about you. It doesn't matter whether you are or you aren't. What we do know is that you as a person have these patterns. So forget the name of it. Just know that this is kind of like a map to you. And that map is like going to lead to treasure or it's going to lead to dead ends. And so we just want to figure out where it's going to go and how to lead it more toward treasure instead of dead ends.
And I think there's also something to be said about like just like personality types, right? Mm-hmm. Like some people are going to enjoy, hey, I have this diagnosis. Now I feel like I'm understood. I have a community.
Yes.
Right? Like this, whether it's a real community that they have like in their like actual space or just kind of like this virtual community, so to speak, where it's like, okay, other people are like this. And some people just truly don't care about that. Like they're like, I'm me. I need to figure out how to adjust myself because I have these things that are harder to deal with than others, you know? Right. And then I think that really comes down to the individual figuring out, okay, what are some things that I struggle with? Okay, if I struggle here, let's say with ADHD, like, all right, I struggle with focus or being able to, you know, stay on task, or I can stay really, really on task for certain things, but not others, right? Like, how do I manage this in my day to day? And it's really about figuring out, okay, what are some of the things that are making it harder in my life? Okay, what can I do to like not have that happen all the time? Doesn't mean that's never going to happen, you know, but like, how can I adjust my schedule to make it a little bit better, you know,
right,
on a general basis, like on a day-to-day basis? How can I not feel as, you know, distracted, right, or as overwhelmed? Because I know that that's something that's like a big thing, like just being super overwhelmed with like there's 12 million thoughts constantly going, and then it's like you feel like you can't get a handle on anything. So it's like, okay, well, there are certain behaviors and patterns that like you can do that make that better or worse, right? And like that's gonna, sometimes there's similarities for individuals, but oftentimes it's like an individual thing. Like, hey, when I get up at this time and I do these things in the morning, wow, that really centers me. Okay, and then my brain allows me to then get into things easier, right? Versus for other people, they're like, that doesn't help me at all. Like literally a morning routine doesn't calm my brain down. I need to do this later in the day or whatever it might be, right? So I think it's about figuring out whether it's a diagnosis or not. Okay, if you're having some areas that you're struggling with, anxiety, depression, these types of feelings, okay, how can I manage it? Like what makes me feel better? And something that I always try to talk with clients about too is like, what is actively making you feel worse? Because we're always trying to add behaviors, and oftentimes we're not thinking about subtracting things that are negative. And it's like, if we just took away 2 things that are like, that would like boost you up so much. We don't need to always be adding stuff to our plate. We can sometimes take things away. And that's a really nice reframe, I find, because a lot of times everybody's like so maxed out with things. They're like, I can't add one more thing. And it's like, just take 2 things away that are like really in your way. And there's plenty. There's like, I can name 15 things that I do that are like, that inhibit me, but I still do sometimes. But like, let's try to like not do those, you know, all the time.
Yeah. I agree. You know, if you're a person who struggles with ADHD, you know, and you're constantly being told that you're not listening or that you don't remember certain things, like, well, are you practicing skills to improve attention and focus? And more to the point that you're saying, are there things that I can do not just to practice attention and focus, but to limit my amount of distraction? So maybe I have certain things like where I say to somebody, hey, if you really want my attention, start a conversation this way. And so then I know, like, okay, laptop down, phone down, like TV off, like no distraction, like engage. And there's very simple things that people can do who have attention deficit disorder to like track a conversation. Like I'll tell them, I want you to repeat what you just heard the person say. Not word for word, but summarize it. Give me a quick summary. Give me a one-sentence summary of what Lauren just said. Okay, well, I can't. Well, okay, try again. What was the last thing you heard? Repeat the last word that you heard, right? And so there's little things that you can do to start to keep, but that's a person who's going to take it, right? Like if I were to say, if you were like, Rick, I don't know, and you describe something to me and I'd be like, okay, Lauren, I think I see some of this in you. Like take this home, read it. You're the type of person who's going to read it. You're the type of person who's like, okay, like this is scary maybe at first, but I'm going to read it. I'm going to digest it. I'm going to look up some other resources. And then you might come back and be like, okay, I definitely see some of these things in me. What are some things? And then you're going to work on it. Like in my life, Lauren Conlon's life, these things happen. And so we can look at it and say, okay, Lauren tried these things in these scenarios. It's not going to be, what does TikTok say? Or Instagram say. It's going to, forget that. We're going to try and customize this to like what fits in your life. How do we navigate this with you, your personality, the other individuals and circumstances that exist in your life? And that's where I think, you want people to be able to take it, to say like, hey, here's information that I'm giving you. This does not define you as a person. And I think that's the problem, is you see a diagnosis sometimes and it's like, you're so much more than that. Whoever the person is. And some of the diagnoses are really, really challenging people to work with. And you might be like, oh, like borderline personalities. Those are hard. They're hard because they are exhausting and they are like up and down and all over the place. Like, I don't know how to deal with that. And some people who have bad bipolar disorder, that kind of manic depressive state where they're like really down and then really up, it's like it is unstable for everybody else around them. And so it's hard to engage with people, but sometimes them having that information being like, oh, I'm borderline. Well, what does that mean? It means I constantly value and devalue people. It means my fear of abandonment is what is triggering my anxiety, which makes me want to push people away or act in these impulsive ways. And so now that I know that, I can be like, okay, no, what's the stable way to do this? Like, this is my anxiety. I'm interpreting this wrong, right? I'm going to go back and I'm going to interpret it like there's 3 other ways I can interpret this. I'm going to choose this way. And maybe I might go back to that person and ask for clarification. That's beautiful. That's all you can ask for. Versus a person who's like, I'm borderline, and like just they're off on the deep end. And then at that point, everybody else is going to separate from them. It's going to be like Moses parting the Red Sea here with people abandoning that person. And that's
then it's a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Self-fulfilling prophecy comes true. Like, I told you everybody was going to leave me. Well, you acted in a way to push everyone away. And so, look, it's not easy. And so sometimes a person hearing a diagnosis is as much of a curse as it is a blessing. And unfortunately, each person is going to be on their own journey. And until that person is willing to, or possesses the insight or awareness to look at themselves and say, look, this is partly who I am, or this is a big part of who I am, I need to learn new things.
And I think all of this comes back to, it doesn't matter whether you have a diagnosis or not, or have a therapist or not, or have a group or not, you still have to continuously examine your behaviors, your thoughts, reevaluate things, try new things, make adjustments. And that is my other issue, I think, with the current, pop psychology, TikTok therapy space, is that sometimes it feels like, okay, and that's just partly short form content, right? Like that's just the nature of that beast. But it's like, here's this thing. Okay. And it's like, you still have to, it's not just like you got this. Mm-hmm. That's it. Like you were saying, it's very fluid, and it doesn't matter if it's fluid or not fluid. You still have to make adjustments, because if you are currently in a position to where you feel like whatever you have is a detriment in your life, there's still detriments in your life that you have to work through. It doesn't matter if you have a diagnosis or not. right? Like, okay, what are some ways that I can help myself be in a better position? What are ways that I can communicate with other people where I need help and support, right? Because maybe you do need help and support. Everybody does. So it's like, what are some things that you need, but that still requires a lot of reflection?
Yes.
And you can have the best therapist in the world, the best group in the world. It doesn't matter. You still have to do those things. And then it's about constantly, again, evaluating and reevaluating how that's working. And that's my big gripe with a lot of the content nowadays, is that it's very focused on just like labeling and like, what is this name, and like putting a name to it and like feeling really good about that. But then it just falls short in the like, what are we going to do about it kind of capacity. And that's what I get frustrated with.
Yeah.
And again, that's kind of just par for the course in terms of like short form content, you know, like that's the clickbaity, like rage bait type stuff. Like that's just the way that people do things. And I hate that too, but it is what it is. But that's what's frustrating to me, is that it's like it's almost like taking ownership away from people, you know, when it's like, it should be empowering people to say, oh, okay, if maybe this is what I'm dealing with right now, like either in this current state of my life or just kind of always, what are some things that I can do about this? And so I can empower myself to be better and ask for the right support and get that support that I need. And like, that's just what's so frustrating to me about a lot of the labeling behind things and just falling short. Or again, like we care about your mental health, but like falling short completely with like, what does that actually look like?
Well, and to piggyback off of that, for me, part of the social media phenomenon with it is, I think so many people are trying to promote some of this stuff under the umbrella of inclusion, right? Like it's supposed to be, we're going to expose all of this. And so now we have reasons for these things. But then they do their best to label them and put them in a very specific category rather than continuing to look at the whole person. It's like,
yeah.
So you like, the idea is like, we want to understand everybody. And so we're going to make mental health and diagnosing available to everybody. We want you to see these things and understand these triggers and these symptoms and all these causes and all this stuff. And it's like, if you're this, then you're that. And it's like, but I'm more than that. Shouldn't I be? And it's it's almost counterintuitive to its own purpose. And
that's the whole thing with like group think and group ideology behind anything. And it's like,
I want to label you and put you in a category.
Yeah. It's literally putting you in a box that is containing you and not empowering you to be more. And that's what's so frustrating, from like my perspective and your perspective. And I'm sure so many other people too, is that it's doing the opposite of what it was intended to do, or maybe not. I don't know. I think that, to your point, it should have been like, hey, here was the good intentions, but like now the good intentions have been just kind of, I don't know, taken a hold of, or maybe that's just human nature. I don't know what it is, but the good intentions have been like spoiled to now box people in and keep them in this space, which is so tough. So I guess to close this out, like, what are some things that you think that would be helpful for people moving forward, who maybe have found themselves in this position to where they're like, hey, I got labeled with something. I feel like I've over-identified myself with something. What are some ways that I can move past this? And what are just some ways in general that like us, whether it's like, you know, therapists or just society in general, can help move past this, this cage of over-labeling?
Yeah. I mean, start to recognize that you exist beyond just the terms and criteria used in a definition, right? Like one of the things that I'll ask people to do sometimes is I'll have them draw a big circle and we'll make like a pie graph, like a pie chart. And I'll ask them to write down like these 6 categories, like physical health, social health, emotional health, financial and occupational, spiritual health, and interpersonal relationship, right? Now, if you look at those categories, that's essentially like a composite configure of every single person. Like that's all the major categories. And so I would say to you, and you can use this in a lot of different ways, but I would say like, in what way does this diagnosis impact all of these areas? And in what way does that diagnosis not impact any of these areas? Like, you're depressed. Got it. And depression is one that, like, depression and anxiety are on a rise. And part of the reason that they're on a rise is like, let's look at the way our life is structured and what might be causing increases in depressed feelings, what might be causing feelings of loneliness and withdrawal, right? And so, like you were just talking about, like, what's one of those ways? Well, maybe limiting the amount of time you're on your phone. And that in and of itself can have a positive impact. Well, then maybe you replace that with, like, going for a walk, and suddenly you feel better. Not a lot better, but maybe just incrementally. But I like to look at that aspect, and I'll say to people, you know, like, okay, if you were to look at this like on a scale of 1 to 10, where would you put yourself in each one of these categories in terms of satisfaction? So somebody might be like, well, I'm in the gym. A lot of your clients will be like, so I feel like I'm at like an 80 or 90% physically. Great. Where are you at socially? You know, like 3 out of 10. Okay. Where are you at spiritually? 2 out of 10. Like, where are you at financially and occupationally? 7 out of 10 or 8 out of 10. And so you can look at it and be like, okay, well, what are some of the areas that we can see? Well, the one that was 2 out of 10 spiritually, maybe like what's going to enhance your spiritual connection with God and things like that. And maybe that's attending church. Maybe it's joining a Bible study group. Maybe it's reading about new religions and experiencing things. Maybe it's traveling. And so suddenly it's like, okay, I'm not just this one category. And so I start to look at the person as a whole rather than just the diagnosis. It's like, this is who you are. You're these categories for the most part. Whatever that is. So let's put the diagnosis over here for a minute. What can you do to be a better person in these things for you? And so it's like, well, I was a 1 out of 10 physically. Well, okay, well, let's get to the gym 2 or 3 times this week, right? You know, I can do things where I can call people more often. I can make plans. I can arrange things rather than waiting for people to do those things. I can make more of an effort and read these books and do these things in my relationship, and I can plan date nights or do whatever. I can look at myself occupationally and say, well, I'm really unsatisfied with my career. Maybe I want to go back to school. Maybe I want a new job. Maybe I need to quit this one and start with a different company, whatever it is. And all of a sudden, what are we talking about? I'm talking about you as a person and not this diagnosis. And so this becomes the focus. You as a whole, complete person, not 1 or 2 pages out of a book, right? Now, those 1 or 2 pages out of a book, can they be important? Sure, but they're not everything. There is so much more to an individual than just that diagnosis. And I want you to see that. I want you to see that you're a friend and a father and a neighbor and a stranger and a coworker and a husband and a wife and a daughter and a pastor and a mentor and a coach and a smile on the walk that a person takes in the morning. Like, there's so many more things to you. Stop hyper focusing on just this one element that is ultimately pretty negative. And let's look at the fact that there's so many other really great things that you are and can be. And suddenly the diagnosis doesn't mean that much anymore, because now you're focusing on all the things that make you a healthier, happier, more well-balanced person.
Yeah, I could not have said that better. That's like a perfect way to summarize all this. And I think that it's not downplaying the diagnosis. It's not eliminating it. It's not pretending it doesn't exist. It's just saying, hey, this isn't the most important thing about you. And there are other better things that we can focus on. And how do we live with this and make your life better ultimately, because you have this knowledge, right? And not letting it weigh you down, and instead letting you like grow from it and be better because of it, and not necessarily something that has to weigh you down constantly. So I know this is kind of a touchy topic, and I think that a lot of times it's, it gets a lot of heat on both sides. There's the people who are like, understand that this helps. And then there's people who are like, no, don't label it. Like, it's just very, very polarizing. And I think that I understand why for both reasons, but I think that that's just playing on our own, negative emotions as humans. And instead, like you said, taking it and looking at it like, all right, let's look at the entire person as a person. And what are some things that we can do to improve different areas? Because we all have that, whether you have a diagnosis or not. Like, we can all take this pie chart and be better, right? Like, so everybody who's listening to this podcast, stop it now, or when we're done in a minute, and go and do that, because I think that is so powerful. And again, it's putting the power back to you. It's empowering you, and you're the only person that you have control over. Ultimately, no matter what somebody says, you don't have, whatever. Like, don't listen to that. So, I mean, listen to it, but like, don't let it weigh you down. Yes. So, if anybody is interested in reaching out to work with you, where can they do that?
Full Circle Therapy, FL @gmail.com.
Rick's favorite email address. I'm going to make you a new one and just
don't. Yeah, every week change it. Yeah.
And if you guys are interested in submitting any questions or topics for us to cover on the show, there is an anonymous link in the show notes that you can fill out, whether it's just a topic or a specific question for us. For any inquiries about coaching, mentorship, or consulting, you can visit redefinehealthybrands.com, and we will talk to you guys next week.